Sekiro is finally upon us, and it's Bloodborne for the masses. This is thanks to Activision, published on every platform you can pick it up on: Xbox One, PS4, PC, and of course those premium versions of the consoles. Here I'm looking at the PS4 and the Pro, no review code here, just my own retail copy picked up. I'm still not a fan of that digital destruction that's going on around the digital platform at the moment. But hey ho, here we are playing the game. Is it as good as we hoped it would be? Well, in my personal opinion, yes. It isn't a drastic change from Bloodborne, Dark Souls. It's pretty much the same thing in a different theme, a different world. It's slightly more polished in terms of how it's presented at the time. There's even a tutorial here. Activision's influence is clear, and it is slightly easier, I would say, than other titles in the Bloodborne Dark Souls series from the off. But of course, it's completely unforgiving, and that element of stealth. Now, this started out as a Tenchu remake, and that's quite obvious. Certainly the tutorial is very Tenchu feeling, where you're sneaking through the elements and trying to make yourself unheard, and you can eavesdrop on conversations. The biggest fundamental change from other titles is that Tenchu-like grapple hook that allows you to shoot across certain parts of the areas and the levels without having to traverse everything, and it can come in handy, and it adds much more verticality to the level design and the combat. But overall, you still play through other levels. You can skip through huge chunks once you learn the layout. You can sit at shrines and reload, increase your abilities, and obviously beat all those enemies and the huge hulking beasts which test your might. That really nails that one more go factor, and I love it. It really is an evolution of the old Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, which we've seen before. The elements and the engines look very similar overall, and it isn't a drastic shift up on all these new consoles. The PC version may have a few benefits, but I wouldn't expect a huge leap up, other than obviously much better resolution and performance if you have the hardware. Talking on that subject, the PS4 comes in at 1920 by 1080p. I see no signs of any kind of reconstruction or dynamic scaling here, so that's pretty good, and it looks clean and crisp on a TV at 1080p or a 4K. One HDR is present on this version as well, both versions. It's okay, it's not a great HDR presentation by my initial analysis, so don't expect to be wowed, but it does look good and impressive even on SDR, so it doesn't really make a difference to the game itself. In addition to that, you obviously get the beautiful per object motion blur which we saw in the previous titles, and a much better temporal anti-aliasing which smooths out a lot of the image quality, a lot of the aliasing and shimmer and all that subpixel noise that was evident in Bloodborne, and really ruins the image quality, as you can see an example of here. Still a cracking looking game and a great playing one, but it can look quite old and aliased in this generation as we've moved into the TAA solutions that are present across the board. The PS4 Pro boosts this further up to a 3200 by 1800p. Again, that looks fully native. There's obviously the stochastic sampling and all the noise that I keep covering over and over again. Everything looks like checkerboarding when you pause and zoom in and look at things, but all the post-processing, the motion blur, it's all done on purpose to hide the aliasing and the image quality, so I'm slightly inclined to think it's still 3200 by 1800, and again they use all the reductions on the sampling and the depth of field specifically, which is evident on the PS4, where they definitely do run that at a low resolution, and this is across the horizontal, I'm guessing. It looks like it is, because it gives that fringed, stretched look of the depth of field and some of the post-processing effects, which you don't see on the PS4, or where you compare the PS4 Pro to X, as I've covered in previous other titles. The PS4 doesn't look the same, and that's where I think the savings are coming from. Other elements between the two machines, shadow cascade and shadow quality resolution is slightly better on the PS4 Pro, as does lighting look slightly higher quality overall, but you really do have to be zooming in and looking at this to really notice it. They're nigh on identical in terms of visual presentation, and again, that per object motion blur kicks in as you're moving through the elements and spinning the camera around, which again looks smooth and gives a nice CGI presentation to the beautiful and violent action in the game. So the final element of this analysis is the performance. There's two parts to this. One, there's the input latency. And they don't fall the same. Just like performance and resolution, there is a difference. Not a huge one, but certainly the Pro is better than the PS4, and that's largely down to the fact that it runs a higher frame rate. The PS4 is capped at 30. So what we're seeing at worst case scenario, taking into account the engine input latency, whatever your TV is itself, it might be different. I'm averaging here around 19.6 milliseconds of TV input. We're seeing at worst 138.73 milliseconds on the PS4 Pro, and at best 88.7. That's quite a variation, and that's in the middle of combat. So if it's jittering and stuttering down to those 30 FPS levels, you'll expect somewhere around that higher margin, and higher up when you're zooming around looking at the sky, it can hit highs of around 88 milliseconds. Now the PS4 is a little worse. It comes in with a high of 151 milliseconds and a low of 122. So between them, the mean or the average is 113 milliseconds on the Pro and 136 milliseconds on the PS4. It isn't a huge amount. I doubt anyone would feel and notice the difference, but it is there if you are wanting to test. Now, in terms of the actual performance, well, again, they're very, very different. Unlike we saw with the Dark Souls 3 release and then the the uncapped to 60 FPS and 1080p, this actually improved the PS4 version, the PS4 Pro in boost mode, which I covered way back when it was released, to a much closer to 60 FPS title, and it felt much better, much smoother and more responsive, and eliminated those frame pacing issues which consistently plague this engine overall. And that is a consistent performance overall. It averages around the 45s. You can check that video out, link on screen, way back when I covered it before, and again input latency on that title. Here though, we're seeing a much worse performance. There's no option here, and downsampling is always enabled even at 1080p, so you are stuck at the performance we're seeing on the Pro and the PS4, which you can see here. Now this means that you don't theoretically get frame pacing issues on the PS4 Pro because it's uncapped, but obviously you do because it skips between 16, 33 and sometimes 50 milliseconds in action, which can feel a little random, especially when you're panning the camera and looking at long distance. In combat though, it's pretty normal, and as you would expect of every other From Software title on console, you're not really going to feel a huge difference. And that means on the PS4 you get frame pacing issues just as before. It's arguably slightly better, slightly worse. There's not a lot in it. It's certainly no better overall. It's still there, it still happens, and it can spike into 50 milliseconds more often than the PS4 Pro, and that's not a good thing. The real-time cinematics can also have some stutters and hangs up into the 160, 180 milliseconds when it shifts from one shot to the next, loading new mesh data, textures, and all the assets. And obviously, again, with that temporal motion blur in there, the per-object motion blur, the velocity vectors all kick in, and you get that slight blur when the camera jumps straight across, and then it straightens out as the velocity is carried over, and that's a common sign which you've seen on many other titles, way back to Assassin's Creed Unity and the Order 1886. So it's a great looking title, and it's visually and artistically very well polished, and it's certainly, I would say, probably the most polished From Software title overall. A great intro, soundtrack, voiceover, and the Japanese dialogue in this game is amazing. So definitely play it with that and the subtitles in English. That's the way I prefer to play it. But performance isn't ideal, and I'm a little let down that they don't have a 1080p mode here on the PS4 Pro. It would make perfect sense, so please, From Software or Activision, if you can, add that to this mode, and of course the Xbox One X, because I believe if you did, this would be very close to 60 FPS, and it would feel and play much better. And for me, and this type of title, it would be a sacrifice well worth taking. Anyway, that's it. It's short, but you get the information. If you like this or anything else, like, don't like, share, it's all good. I'll catch you maybe on the next one.